Why did it take 5 years to catch the man accused of killing a 2-year-old boy? That's the question haunting the family of Jamir Jones, a toddler from Columbus, Ohio. In 2020, he was found unresponsive in a bathtub while in the care of his mother's boyfriend, Dioblis Williams. The first reports claimed Jamir had drowned. But the autopsy told a far different story: blunt force trauma. What looked like an accident was ruled a homicide. And the man investigators believed responsible vanished for years before finally resurfacing in disguise, hundreds of miles away. Today, we're not just revisiting another headline. We're breaking down the red flags, the delays, and the manhunt that finally brought an accused child killer back into custody. If you're here because you want clarity, not sensationalism, subscribe so you never miss cases that teach us the lessons we can't afford to overlook. Jamir Jones was only 2 years old. He loved people, he lit up every room, and he should have had a lifetime ahead of him. On the day everything changed, March 25, 2020, he was being watched by his mother's boyfriend, Dioblis Williams. Williams wasn't Jamir's father, but he was in the role of caregiver that day. When Jamir was discovered unresponsive in the bathtub, the explanation was simple: drowning. For a moment, people wanted to believe that. But when doctors examined him, the evidence didn't fit. The bruises, the abdominal injuries, the internal trauma, none of it matched an accident. So let's be clear about the questions this case answers. Who is Dioblis Williams? Who was Jamir Jones? Why wasn't Williams arrested earlier? And how did police finally catch him, after so long on the run? These are the questions people ask, and they're the ones we'll walk through step by step. At first, Jamir's death was ruled a drowning. Families cling to explanations that feel less painful. Communities want quick answers. But autopsies don't exist to comfort. They exist to tell the truth. Jamir's autopsy revealed blunt force trauma to the abdomen and bruising inconsistent with a slip in the tub. This wasn't a tragic accident. It was a homicide. That single conclusion shifted the case from heartbreak to criminal investigation, and it put Dioblis Williams in the center of the frame. When you look back, there are always warning signs. When explanations don't match injuries, that's a red flag. When a child suddenly withdraws, flinches at touch, or changes behavior, that's a red flag. When the caregiver insists on a simple narrative after a medical emergency, that's another flag. In Jamir's case, those red flags were silent until the medical examiner gave them a voice. Investigators had evidence pointing toward Williams. He was alone with Jamir in the critical time window, and the medical findings contradicted the drowning story. Soon, the charge escalated to murder. But here's where clarity is crucial. Charging someone is not the same as arresting them. And Williams? He disappeared. That's why this case didn't end in 2020. It only began. For Jamir's family, every passing month felt heavier. They had lost a child, they had an autopsy that ruled homicide, they had a suspect named, but no arrest. Birthdays passed. Courtrooms stayed empty. Justice was not denied, but it was painfully delayed. And in cases like this, that gap, the space between evidence and custody, becomes unbearable for families who live in the aftermath. So here's what this part of the case teaches us. Document patterns. Don't dismiss small incidents, note dates, photos, and explanations. Report early if something feels off. You're not making accusations, you're alerting authorities who can investigate. Trust the medical evidence. When professionals say injuries don't match the story, that is your signal to act. Ordinary people can't prevent every crime, but they can amplify early warnings that save lives. So why did it take 5 years to catch Williams? When a suspect disappears early, it forces investigators into two simultaneous battles. First, building a case strong enough to stand in court. Second, finding someone who doesn't want to be found. And both take time. Building a homicide case is not just about pointing to one person and saying, "He did it." Prosecutors need evidence that can withstand defense challenges. They need to prove the injuries weren't accidental. They need timelines, witness statements, and expert testimony. In Jamir's case, the medical examiner was key, but the prosecution still had to establish that Williams caused those injuries beyond a reasonable doubt. That takes months, sometimes years, especially when the suspect is not in custody. Then there was the manhunt itself. Williams didn't just leave Columbus. He effectively dropped off the map. For families and communities, this feels like failure. How can someone accused of killing a toddler simply vanish? But in reality, fugitives rely on a few simple strategies. They move between states. They cut ties with anyone who might betray them. They change their look. And they blend into the noise of everyday life, because unless someone is actively searching, people don't notice the stranger on the bus or the man at the corner store. For nearly 5 years, that's what happened. Williams lived under the radar while Jamir's family waited. Every delay, every year without an arrest, was another wound. For them, time wasn't moving forward. It was standing still. Why no arrest right away? Because a warrant isn't a capture. Police need new leads, cross-state help, and, yes, sometimes, luck. Fugitives who cross state lines complicate everything, because it requires coordination between local police, state authorities, and federal marshals. Without consistent tips or sightings, years can slip by. For people watching from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But behind the scenes, investigators keep files open, they monitor databases, and they quietly wait for the suspect to make a mistake. Because eventually, fugitives do. They get comfortable. They reach out to someone. They leave digital traces. And in this case, that's exactly what happened. During those lost years, Jamir's family kept pressing. They held on to the autopsy that proved homicide. They kept the case alive in their community. And they waited. For them, the question was simple: if we know who did this, why isn't he behind bars? That's the question every parent, every relative, every friend of a victim asks when justice feels delayed. The truth is, justice is rarely fast. It's deliberate. And while that may be hard for families to hear, it's how cases like this eventually stick. So here's the take-home lesson from this part of the story. When justice feels slow, it doesn't mean it isn't moving. Homicide cases are built like walls, brick by brick, detail by detail, until the structure can't be knocked down. And while fugitives can hide, they can't erase the evidence behind them. The investigation doesn't disappear, even if they try to. For Jamir, those 5 years were the silence before the break. Because eventually, Williams made the mistake investigators had been waiting for. He left digital breadcrumbs that led authorities directly to him. And once they knew where to look, the disguise, the distance, the years, it all collapsed. So how did they finally catch Dioblis Williams? The break came from the one place fugitives often slip up: online. Investigators discovered that Williams had resurfaced on Instagram. After years of silence, his digital trail gave law enforcement something solid to work with. Through careful monitoring, they were able to connect the account to his activity in Massachusetts. Suddenly, after 5 years of uncertainty, they had a direction. Surveillance began quietly. Agents watched, confirmed movements, and built enough evidence to move in. Then came the final moment. In Framingham, Massachusetts, Williams was spotted wearing a wig, an attempt to disguise himself and throw people off. But disguises only work until someone is already watching. August 27, 2025, law enforcement closed in, and the arrest was made. The man who vanished in 2020 was now back in custody, facing the charges he had evaded for so long. For Jamir's family, it was a moment of relief wrapped in sorrow. Relief that the suspect was finally caught. sorrow because it could never bring Jamir back. After 5 long years, they could finally see the case moving forward. What happens next? Williams is now facing charges for Jamir's death. The legal process will determine his guilt in court, but the key fact remains: the case is no longer frozen in time. Justice delayed doesn't mean justice denied, and this arrest proves that even fugitives who think they've escaped can be brought back to face the consequences. But beyond the courtroom, this case leaves us with important lessons. First, never underestimate digital footprints. In today's world, fugitives may hide their faces, but they rarely hide their online presence forever. A single post, a single connection, can unravel years of evasion. Second, understand why delays happen. Families and communities often feel abandoned when cases take years. But homicide investigations are deliberate. Prosecutors need airtight cases, and law enforcement has to wait for the right moment to capture without risk of losing the suspect again. It's not easy, but it's designed to make sure that when charges stick, they stick for good. Third, remember the red flags. This case started with a false narrative, a drowning story that didn't match the injuries. If you see situations where explanations don't line up with evidence, don't look away. Children can't advocate for themselves. Communities, neighbors, and even strangers sometimes have to. And finally, know that silence is never neutral. Silence protects abusers, not victims. Speaking up, even if you're wrong, gives investigators something to work with. And sometimes, it's the only chance a child has. Jamir Jones's story is devastating. A 2-year-old boy with a whole future ahead of him was taken far too soon. For 5 years, his family lived with grief and unanswered questions. But today, the man accused of his murder is no longer hiding. He will face trial. And Jamir's name will be spoken in courtrooms, not just in past tense at family gatherings. So here's the takeaway for all of us. Justice can be slow. It can feel like nothing is happening. But cases don't disappear, and fugitives don't stay hidden forever. Whether through evidence, persistence, or digital mistakes, truth has a way of catching up. Jamir's story should never have had to teach us these lessons. But if we learn them, if we see the signs earlier, if we report sooner, if we push for accountability, we can prevent other families from living through the same nightmare. Justice for Jamir may not erase the pain, but it closes the silence. And that's a start. If this case helped you see the bigger picture, share it with someone else. And if you never want to miss the next story that teaches us lessons we can't afford to ignore, subscribe to Behind Closed Doors. Because here, we don't just talk about crime. We learn from it.